It started with a photograph. Faded edges, warm smiles. Two people who used to be everything to each other. Now, just pixels and distance. Maybe you have a photo like that tucked in a drawer somewhere, or a name that still echoes in the quiet parts of your heart. A child, a sibling, someone you loved deeply, but time, life, or pain built walls between you. You've tried to forget, or maybe you've tried to reach out, but nothing changed. And now, there's silence, an ache with no words. But what if I told you? Heaven never stopped writing that story. Archangel Michael sees what you buried under layers of grief and pride. He knows about the relationship that once gave you joy and now gives you sorrow. And today, He's not here to scold you for what fell apart. He's here to whisper, it's not over. There is a plan in motion, a divine restoration already unfolding behind the scenes. Because heaven doesn't waste love. It heals it, and if you've been carrying the quiet weight of a lost connection, this message is for you. Not to shame, but to remind that your heart still remembers because it was meant to. So breathe, sit with me. Let's take a gentle walk through the sacred path of restoration. A journey heaven began long before you ever knew you'd need it. Disconnection can feel like grief without a funeral. You don't wear black. There's no official goodbye. But the absence is loud, especially in the quiet moments. A birthday passes, a holiday arrives, and there's that empty space at the table. Or in your heart. I once met a man named Paul. He hadn't spoken to his younger brother in 12 years. One heated argument, one prideful silence, and then years just rolled on. Every Christmas, Paul would take out the old photo album, flip to a page where they were laughing by the lake, and then quietly close it again. No one really talks about the grief of someone who's still alive, he said. But I feel it every day. That's the thing. Broken relationships don't always leave visible scars, but they shape us, how we trust, how we speak, even how we pray. And many people, especially as they get older, begin to wonder, did I wait too long? Did the bridge already burn? But here's what I want you to know. Heaven hasn't forgotten. That relationship you ache for, it's not buried, it's being held. Your prayers, your tears, your longing to reconnect, they've all been collected. They're not just emotions, they're signals. And heaven responds to them, even when nothing seems to change on the outside, because heaven sees not just the people, but the connection between them. And sometimes, what looks broken is simply paused, waiting for a divine moment to restart. In the next part, we'll explore what heaven actually sees when a relationship breaks and why Archangel Michael is watching over those fragile bonds more closely than you think. In heaven, nothing is truly forgotten, not even broken relationships. There's a belief, ancient and beautiful, that heaven keeps scrolls, not just of your name, but of your bonds, the people your soul has loved, the moments that shaped your heart, and yes, even the fractures. I like to think of it this way. If your life were a tapestry, every person you've loved is a thread. Some threads stay vibrant, others fray. Some snap entirely. But even when a thread breaks, the pattern isn't ruined. It's simply waiting to be rewoven. I remember a woman named Irene. She hadn't spoken to her daughter in over a decade. Harsh words slammed doors, years of silence. Every Mother's Day, she'd sit alone with a card she never sent, handwritten, hopeful, folded away. She used to ask, "Does God even care about a relationship that's this far gone?" But what she didn't know was that every night, her daughter, hundreds of miles away, was looking at an old voicemail from her, unable to delete it. Heaven sees that, because while we see silence, heaven sees tension, sacred tension, a cord that hasn't broken, only stretched. And in that space of stretching, angels move. Archangel Michael, the protector, doesn't just defend people, he defends connections. He guards those fragile threads that feel forgotten. He stands at the places where hearts once met and says, "Not yet. This isn't the end." So if you've been feeling like the love you gave was wasted, or the pain too deep to repair, remember, what's recorded in heaven is never lost. The thread still exists, and it can be rewoven. In the next part, we'll explore why some relationships have to break before they can be rebuilt, and how divine timing plays a bigger role than we often realize. Sometimes things have to fall apart so they can be rebuilt on truth. That sounds harsh at first, doesn't it? Especially when what fell apart was once beautiful, full of laughter, memories, promises. But here's what I've learned: some relationships don't end because of a lack of love. They pause because growth had to happen apart. I once met a woman named Carla. She and her sister were inseparable growing up. But as they got older, life tugged them in opposite directions. One pursued a career across the country. The other stayed close to home, raising a family. Expectations clashed. Words were exchanged. The last thing Carla said to her sister was, "Maybe it's better if we don't talk for a while." That while turned into 5 years. But here's what Carla didn't realize. During that silence, both of them were changing, healing, understanding things they couldn't have seen before. And when they finally reunited, awkward at first, quiet at the kitchen table, they both agreed we couldn't have come back together as the people we were. We needed to become who we are now. Some breaks are not the end. They are divine intermissions. Heaven knows that forced closeness can breed deeper pain. So sometimes God allows the space, not as punishment, but as preparation. The distance becomes a place where perspective grows, where humility softens old pride, where wounds begin to breathe, and most importantly, where the foundation can be rebuilt, not on the past, but on truth. If you're in a season where things feel irreparably broken, don't rush to fix it too soon. Let the space do its work. Trust that heaven isn't panicking. Archangel Michael isn't wringing his hands. He's standing between both hearts, guarding what's still sacred. Because when the time is right, restoration will come. And in the next part, we'll talk about what that hidden preparation looks like. How even in silence, heaven is shaping both sides of the story. Just because nothing is happening on the surface doesn't mean nothing is happening at all. Heaven often works in the quiet. While we're watching the clock, expecting a phone call, checking for signs. The real transformation is happening behind the curtain. I think of Richard, a father who hadn't spoken to his adult son in over 6 years. The fallout had been sharp and painful, words said in anger, pride guarding both sides. Richard prayed often, but nothing changed. His son didn't call, no messages, just silence. What Richard didn't know was that miles away, his son had started seeing a counselor, had begun unpacking childhood hurts, had started healing not just from their last argument, but from years of unspoken pain. He wasn't ready to return yet, but he was on the road. That's what hidden preparation looks like. While you're sitting in your kitchen wondering, should I reach out again? Heaven might be softening a heart, calming a memory, planting a thought. Sometimes God removes someone, not to punish, but to rebuild them where you can't see. And while that's happening, something else is at work in you too. You're learning patience. You're releasing control. You're discovering what it means to pray not for quick results, but for deep healing. We often want reconnection on our terms, but heaven waits until both sides can meet with humility, not history, with truth, not tension. And when they do, it feels different, softer, deeper. It lasts. So if everything feels still right now, don't be discouraged. Restoration takes time, and heaven never rushes what it's making sacred. In the next part, we'll talk about the moment Archangel Michael steps in, not with noise, but with quiet authority, to protect what's meant to be restored in your life. When heaven begins to move, it rarely announces itself with thunder. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, or a protection you didn't even notice. That's where Archangel Michael comes in, not just as a warrior, but as a guardian of timing, space, and sacred restoration. Michael doesn't force hearts open. He doesn't rush apologies or make phone calls for us. What he does is guard the unseen. He holds back interference. He protects the process. He shields the growing place where reconciliation is quietly being born. I met a woman named Grace who told me something remarkable. She'd been praying for reconciliation with her estranged mother for years. But every time she felt ready to reach out, something stopped her: a delayed flight, a forgotten birthday, a sense of hesitation she couldn't explain. I thought I was failing, she said, but later I realized I was being protected. Because when the moment finally did come, when she did reach out, her mother had just come out of a season of deep healing, therapy, prayer, forgiveness work. Had Grace called earlier, the door might have still been locked. That's the ministry of Archangel Michael. He doesn't just protect people, he protects timing. He holds space for the right moment to arrive. Not when emotions demand it, but when hearts are truly ready. Michael stands in the space between people like a sentinel of peace, guarding what matters most, even when we can't see the full picture. So if you've felt delay, if you've felt strangely held back, maybe it's not rejection, maybe it's protection, because divine reconciliation is delicate. It needs the right moment, the right posture, the right softness in the soul. And Michael is making sure that when it happens, it lasts. In the next part, we'll explore how to recognize when that restoration is already beginning through signs, nudges, and unexpected openings that only heaven could orchestrate. Restoration rarely knocks on the front door. It often slips in through the side window, quiet and unexpected. But if you pay attention, you'll notice the signs, small, subtle, but sacred, like a name suddenly coming to mind out of nowhere. A dream that brings back a familiar face, a random memory that stirs both warmth and ache, or even something as simple as a song on the radio that once belonged to your story with that person. These aren't coincidences, they're signals. I remember a man named Elijah who hadn't spoken to his daughter in nearly a decade. One morning, while cleaning out his attic, he found her old music box, one she'd loved as a child. It played a tune he hadn't heard in years. He sat on the floor and cried. That same week, his daughter posted on social media for the first time in months. Nothing dramatic, just a picture of a daisy and a caption that read, "Starting over." To anyone else, it was nothing. But to Elijah, it was heaven saying now. That's how God often moves, through nudges, alignments, reminders. Archangel Michael knows how to orchestrate these moments. He leads you gently to the edge of possibility, then lets your heart decide whether to step forward. But these signs aren't just sentimental, they're invitations to soften your posture, to open the door just a little, to believe that restoration might already be on the way. The key is to respond not with force, but with faith. Maybe it's time to write that message, or pray that simple prayer, God, if it's time, make the path clear, because the signs won't shout, but they will whisper. And if you're hearing those whispers, heaven is near. In the next part, we'll talk about the one key that unlocks the door to reconciliation more than anything else, an act more powerful than words. Forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about saying, "It didn't hurt." It's about saying, "It won't control me anymore." For many of us, the idea of reconnecting with someone we once loved but were deeply hurt by brings up resistance, not because we don't miss them, but because we're still carrying the weight of what happened. And here's the truth: forgiveness isn't easy, but it is powerful. It's not a feeling. It's a decision, not to erase the past, but to release its grip on your future. I once met a retired teacher named Helen. She hadn't spoken to her best friend in 15 years. A betrayal over something small, but the silence grew bigger with time. One day, Helen decided to write a letter, not to send it, but to free herself. She wrote, "You hurt me, and I've been holding on to that pain like armor. But it's too heavy now. I forgive you." She didn't mail it, but something shifted. 2 weeks later, completely unplanned, she bumped into that same friend at a coffee shop. And do you know what her friend said? "I've been thinking about you. I was too ashamed to reach out." That's what forgiveness does. It unlocks doors you didn't even know were jammed. It softens the air between two people. It moves angels into motion. Archangel Michael watches for that moment, the moment a heart chooses release over resentment. Because when forgiveness enters, healing follows. And let me be clear, Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. But reconciliation can't happen without it. So if your heart has been waiting for the other person to go first, maybe it's your turn, not to excuse the pain, but to clear the path. In the next part, we'll talk about what happens when you finally let go, how heaven begins to move once you've surrendered control and allowed divine timing to take over. Letting go isn't giving up, it's giving God space to work. We often think we have to fix everything ourselves, say the right words, make the perfect move, rehearse every possible outcome in our minds. But some of the most beautiful restorations happen not through effort, but through surrender. I once met a man named Frank who hadn't spoken to his adult son in over 8 years. They had clashed during a difficult season. Misunderstandings raised voices, doors closed in frustration. Frank had written letters, tried calling, even showed up once, but nothing worked. Eventually, he stopped trying, not out of bitterness, but out of trust. I placed it in God's hands, he told me, not because I stopped caring, but because I finally believed he cared more than I ever could. Months passed, then a year, and then, one Thanksgiving morning, the doorbell rang. It was his son, with a pie in one hand and tears in his eyes. I wasn't ready before, he said, but something shifted, and I wanted to come home. That something was surrender. When we let go, not emotionally, but spiritually, we invite heaven's timing into the story. We stop striving. We stop forcing. And that's when angels like Michael step forward. Because surrender isn't passive. It's powerful. It's saying, God, I trust you with what I can't carry anymore. And when you do that, heaven begins to move in ways you couldn't plan. Letting go doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you start loving in a way that gives room for miracles. So if you've been trying, pushing, begging, hoping, and still seeing no change, maybe it's time to step back, not in defeat, but in faith. Because when your hands are open, God's hands go to work. In the next part, we'll look at what restoration really looks like in real life. Not the fantasy, but the slow, sacred rebuilding that stands the test of time. Restoration doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a quiet hello. We often imagine reconciliation as a dramatic moment, tears, hugs, apologies that fix everything. But more often than not, healing comes in simple, ordinary ways. A shared laugh, a text message, an old inside joke that still works. True restoration isn't about returning to what was. It's about creating something new, something softer, wiser, more honest. I met a woman named Linda who hadn't seen her younger brother in over 20 years. They'd grown up close, but life pulled them apart. Different cities, different values, an argument that went too far. Then one day, at a mutual friend's funeral, they saw each other again. No big speeches, just a gentle nod, a small smile. Later, over coffee, her brother said, "I missed having you around." That was it. No rehearsed apology, just presence. And that was enough to begin again. Because restoration isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing connection over perfection. It's about two people who are willing to try, not to fix everything at once, but to take the next step together. Sometimes that step is awkward, sometimes it's quiet, but every little step matters. Archangel Michael isn't just the protector of grand victories. He also watches over these small moments, because heaven celebrates even the first crack in the wall, even the first breath of courage. So if your restoration doesn't look like the movies, don't be discouraged. If it looks like a text that says thinking of you, or a voicemail that ends with call me if you want to talk, or even just the courage to pray for them again, that's restoration too. In the next part, we'll talk about how your story, yes, yours, isn't finished. That even now heaven is rewriting the ending with more grace than you ever imagined. Your story isn't over, it's being rewritten. And no, not rewritten to erase the past, but to redeem it. That's what heaven does. It takes the pages we thought were wasted, the painful chapters, the silent years, the missed chances, and turns them into soil where something new can grow. I once spoke with a man named Joseph. At 67, he believed the window had closed on restoring his relationship with his eldest daughter. Too many years lost, he said. Too much I didn't understand when it mattered. But one day, out of nowhere, he received a letter, handwritten, 3 pages long. It began with, "Dad, I've been angry for a long time, but I'm tired of carrying it alone." That letter didn't erase the past, but it began a new chapter. And Joseph told me, with tears in his eyes, I didn't know healing could still happen in this season of life. But that's what heaven does. It works in seasons we think are done. It brings light to corners we gave up on. It rewrites the ending, not for drama, but for peace. Maybe your story has held silence for too long. Maybe the chapter you're in feels unresolved. But Archangel Michael is here to remind you, you are not forgotten. Your love was not in vain, and your ending is not yet written. So hold on, let heaven keep writing, because the pen is still moving, and in our final part, we'll reflect on what it means to believe again, to open your heart once more to connection, healing, and the quiet courage of love restored. To believe again, that might be the bravest thing you do. After all the waiting, the silence, the what-ifs, and maybe next times, to still believe that healing is possible, that love can return, that God is still working, that's no small thing. It's sacred. I met a woman named Teresa in a small church in Ohio. She told me, I light a candle every Sunday for my sister. We haven't spoken in 19 years. When I asked her why she still did it, she smiled softly and said, "Because I still believe she'll come home." And that's what heaven honors. Not just big gestures, but the quiet faith of a heart that refuses to harden, the one that stays open, wounded, yes, but still hoping. Archangel Michael walks closely with people like Teresa, people like you, people who carry old photos, half-written letters and prayers that haven't yet been answered, but keep showing up anyway. Because in heaven's eyes, faith that survives silence is the most powerful kind. So if you've made it this far, through all the pain, all the memories, all the letting go, you're stronger than you know. And you're not alone. Your story matters, and your love still echoes, and your restoration, is already unfolding. Maybe today's the day you take one step, send the message, say the prayer, light the candle. Because someone out there might be waiting too, and maybe, just maybe, heaven has chosen this moment for you both to begin again. Type Amen in the comments if you're ready to believe again. If this spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs hope. You never know whose restoration story is about to begin because of you.